Tom Tugendhat, who's well known as an extremely influential Conservative Member of Parliament, and who's been eloquent in his views on China, and to be blunt, the threat that China poses in many ways to the West, to our values, to our economic interests, and to China. And Tom has also been quite eloquent about China's domestic policy and its human rights issues. So Tom's well known as an outspoken commentator on Chinese issues. He is, as I said earlier today, chair of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, which is an extremely influential role as well. So it'll be great if Gordon Corera from the BBC, who's with us, great to see you, Gordon, can talk to Tom about China. Thanks.
I'd just like to welcome you both and thank you both for being here. And I'm going to go silent during your conversation, and then I will come back in with any questions at the conclusion. So thank you both. Welcome. Turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Suzanne and Nick. Pleasure to be here and part of the Cipher brief, and also to be able to talk to Tom. Tom, I'm glad to say you're still chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, because there were some interesting emails and messages going around a few weeks ago, weren't there, which seemed to be in your name, claiming you'd resigned. Did you ever get to the bottom of that? What actually happened?
I may not have resigned, but I'm not unmuted either. Look, I think it was just low-level annoyance, probably by somebody who was just having a bit of fun out of Beijing. I was lucky enough to have some friends in the west coast of the United States who had access to the source data from the emails that were registered under my name. And it will come as no surprise to hear that one or two of those email addresses was registered in Shanghai, and one or two of them were registered in Beijing.
Not the first time something like that's happened to you, I think, in recent years. And I suppose the reason is that you have come to be seen as a China hawk from your position on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and also the work leading the China Research Group, which is out there to inform people about China really in the UK in Parliament. Do you accept that description of you as a China hawk?
Well, as you know, Gordon, I have quite a strong policy of not criticising what people say about me. They're allowed to. I do actually believe in a free press. You can say what you like about me, but I don't think of myself as a China hawk. I consider myself hugely interested in global cooperation and a real believer in democracy as a form of government that seeks to achieve the greatest prosperity and happiness for the greatest number of people. And what we are seeing out of China, I don't think is good for the Chinese people. So I would argue that I'm a Chinese Communist Party hawk, but actually in many ways I'm a China dove. I'm hugely pro-China. I would love to see China retaking its place in the world. I think one of the great sadnesses of the last 70 years is that for much of the last 70 years, China has not been around the top table. You know, when you look at how the international order was being created in the 1940s, China's voice was essential. P.C. Chang was one of the writers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The principles of Confucianism that he embedded into those declarations of human rights inform the liberties that we enjoy here in the UK today. It's absolutely essential. So the idea that this is a values war between China and the West is complete rubbish. It's a values war between communist dictators and free people. And it's a values war on which we are on the side of the Chinese people and their oppressors are not.
That's an interesting description of it, because some people say that there's too much emphasis from Western sides about stopping China's rise. You make it sound as if you're comfortable with China's rise, but perhaps not if it's led by the Communist Party, which is what it looks like being led for some time, because it's hard to see that changing.
Look, I am. I'm not only comfortable with China's rise, I want China's rise. China's economic rise is a massive boost to global economic prosperity and therefore to the prosperity of the British people. There is absolutely no question in my mind that a peaceful, law-based, rules-based, human rights compliant China would be a huge boost to the people of the United Kingdom, who I'm privileged enough to represent in Parliament and speak for on foreign affairs through Parliament. I think that would, I don't see any question about it. the ability to harness Chinese scientists to answer some of the global questions of environmentalism, communication, of technology, any number of different things, is a huge opportunity for us all. And the great sadness is that instead of seeing that extraordinary culture and intellect being put to the use that we know it can be put towards, it's instead being used as a repressive form of technology to control about 1 billion people. And I'm reminded constantly when we talk about China that what we're trying to talk about here is the prosperity and happiness of the Chinese people as much as the British people, because it's one world, mate. We're all in it together.
One of the concerns, you mentioned kind of academia and scientists, one of the concerns has been Chinese influence in the UK and how far the UK has been alert to those signs of Chinese influence. I mean, we've obviously come a long way from a few years ago when we talked about the kind of golden age of investment and cooperation. Do you sense that the mood has shifted now, or is it just shifted within certain quarters about perhaps thinking harder about what Chinese money and influence looks like in the UK?
I think that has shifted. I think one of the things that's striking is when I started to talk about the relationship that we've got with the Chinese Communist Party and the concerns that I have about it in 2017, to say I was an outlier would be a polite way of putting it. Friends of mine thought I was insane to be critical of. I'm not looking at anyone in particular, Nick. But friends of mine thought I was insane to be making to be critical of agreements with Huawei or indeed with other businesses. And when I set out that I wasn't being some sort of paranoid, this is about Reds under the beds or communism or anything like that. It's fundamentally about the standards by which the new economic system is going to be built, and therefore it's going to embed itself not just into our communication system, but actually into the very way in which we run an economy, the very way in which we organize a society. People thought I was being, bluntly paranoid, but the reality is that has now changed. People are aware that the way in which the Belt and Road Initiative has been used in parts of Southeast Asia, Africa, or even actually parts of Europe, is directly challenging what you might call a liberal consensus that has existed in various different ways and to a greater or lesser extent, certainly not universal, around the world since the 1970s, 80s, and really much more so since the fall of the Cold War in the 1990s. So, I think we're seeing a greater awareness that the strategic outlook that the Chinese leadership is planning is indeed modeled off the economic prosperity that they feel that they've brought to China by having, Beijing as the center and then having these various different hubs, building up around Shanghai, building up around Guangzhou and so on, and missing the point and the essential point, I think, about the Chinese leadership have got wrong, is that isn't what brought prosperity to the Chinese people. That's what brought control to the Chinese Communist Party. What brought prosperity to the Chinese people was Deng Xiaoping opening up to the wider world, joining the WTO in 2000, all that sort of stuff. It wasn't communism that lifted 850 million people out of poverty. It was communism that put them there. It was globalization that lifted 850 million people out of poverty. And the danger is that the Communist Party has learned the wrong lesson, because actually its only interest is with control and power. And so it's trying to apply the lessons that failed in China onto dependent states, onto satrapies around the world.
You were one of the leading lights in the battle over Huawei and 5G, which certainly played a role in pulling the government back away from a position which allowed Huawei to build 5G networks in the UK. The argument there was partly about technology values and risk. With that battle seemingly over, with the decision reversed and Huawei now out of the UK network, where do you see as the next kind of battlegrounds for you and other colleagues who are worried about some of those issues, particularly to do with technology and values?
So funnily enough, Huawei is an easy battle, and it's an easy battle because effectively what they're doing is they've got one big contract and one big supplier. So and one big client. So by putting pressure on the UK government, we can change that. I mean, I'm not going to pretend it was easy. It wasn't easy, but it's relatively simple process to do. The real challenge that we've got actually is organizations like TikTok. I'm citing them in particular, but actually there are many similar, which are really massive data capture organizations masking themselves as social media sites. Now, you could, by the way, say the same thing about Facebook and Twitter and various others. The difference is they are governed by various forms of rule of law. Now, I'm quite happy to have a longer conversation about how much more rule of law I'd like to see over Facebook. It shouldn't just be up to the whims of Nick Clegg to decide who is and who isn't published on these various different sites. Neither liberal nor Democrat, I would argue, is what we're seeing out of that. But the reality is that those are, broadly speaking, within our value structures. The difference about organizations like TikTok is they are collecting data on a mass scale into a value structure that is not similar to ours and does not cooperate in the same way. Now, as I say, TikTok is an example. There are actually many others, organizations that run payment services, organizations that run communication services, the one that we're not using today, the famous one that we're not using today, are many examples where actually this fight has only just started. And it's not, it's a fight that appears to be minor and about, should we use a Western product over a Chinese product, or a Japanese product over a Chinese product? It's actually about where should we put the investment in technology? Where should we try and seek to advance standards, and where should we seek to embed values? And that's the challenge we've got.
One of the issues over Huawei was that those in favour of keeping it in the UK or in the 5G network said, well, there'll be economic costs of excluding it. It will slow down broadband rollout and other things. And I suppose that is still the kind of wider debate which goes on within the British government, which is the kind of economic benefits of being open to China versus the security risks of doing so. Where do you sense the centre of gravity is now within the government? I mean, you sit there outside of the government in the Foreign Affairs Committee, but obviously with a pretty good view of what's going on inside. Do you sense that, particularly, at the heart of power in Downing Street, that the view is actually it's security first, or is it a balance, or is it the need for global Britain post-Brexit to be trading and to be open? Because you certainly hear slightly mixed messages, even over the recent integrated review.
It's not going to surprise you that the government is looking for prosperity at a time when, frankly, the country has been through the most extraordinary economic shock. Well, I'd argue probably since the Second World War, definitely since Suez, but probably even before that. It's of course the government's looking for prosperity, and of course it's the job of government to seek to expand markets and look for opportunity. And funnily enough, the Treasury is absolutely adamant that they can do that, and they're looking for support from agencies and others to make sure that they can do it safely. But my job isn't to cheerlead. My job is to chuck rocks into their, put sticks in the spokes of their wheels, right? Because my job is to criticize and to challenge. And what I see is the reality is that actually you can believe one of two things, but it's hard to believe them both together. You can either believe that China really is a communist state and that does believe in international humanity and the good of all people in a communist sense, and therefore it is subsidizing the prosperity of the British people through 1,000 different inventions, all of which are designed to help the British people, maybe. Or they are using massive market dominance to undercut suppliers in order to achieve market positions that allow them to secure data and standard setting powers across the international community. Now, I stopped believing in fairies a while ago, and I never did believe in communists. So, you can see where I sit on that. I just don't believe that Huawei was undercutting Nokia, Ericsson, Nortel, and various others over many years because it was an act of generosity by the Chinese people. There's certainly no other indications that was happening in any other area.
One of the themes of this summit is alliances, and I was just wondering where you see and where you're able to talk to people about common ground on China. I mean, it does feel like There are differences within the EU, certainly, about how to approach China about 5G. You can see that, the EU-China investment deal. And then there's also the question about whether really the UK should be looking for alliances with Japan, South Korea, obviously working with India particularly. Where do you see the crucial alliances will be on this subject?
Look, I think, funnily enough, Wolf Warrior diplomacy has made this operation much easier for us. A couple of years ago, when I was talking to colleagues in parliaments around Europe, again, I was seen as rather hawkish. Ever since the Chinese ambassador to Paris accused the French state of murdering old people in care homes over COVID, many more people in France have been aware that this isn't some sort of, foreign and considerate power. And ever since the Chinese ambassador to Stockholm said that for our friends we have flowers, for our enemies we have shotguns, I think the Swedes have understood the message pretty clearly. And ever since Wang Yi, in a press conference with Heiko Maas, decided to open both barrels into my opposite number, the chair of the Czech Senate's Foreign Affairs Committee, Pavel Fischer, I think plenty of people in Central Europe have understood what is the relationship that they're being offered. So funnily enough, I think that the nature of that relationship has changed in Europe in the last 2 years, making it, and by the way, almost entirely down to the Chinese diplomatic service, right? I mean, they have achieved a singular coup in changing the minds of people in Europe as to how they view the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, they haven't changed in the direction they hoped, but they have achieved a remarkable coup. And what that's also done, by the way, is built up alliances around the world. I mean, if you look at the engagement that we have with Japan today, it is markedly different from the engagement we had even 5 years ago. Japan is now talking about joining the Five Eyes community. Now, there are challenges in achieving that. I personally am a supporter of it, but there are challenges, and I'm not going to pretend it could be done tomorrow. But the very fact that they're talking about it is really quite remarkable. And the other day I was speaking to, I won't give his name, but a South Korean, senior South Korean politician who wanted to make it absolutely clear that if Japan joined, then South Korea should join too, and there should be no question about that. Now, this is clearly something that China has spoken out against. If you listen to the Global Times and various spokesmen, they really hate the Five Eyes community, and yet they are driving people towards it. So this is a real change. Now, I think there is a growing international cooperation on China. I think various things like, whether you look at Hanban-Tota Port or Djibouti, or whether you look at the failure of Sinopharm in, the Chinese vaccine in Chile, or the pressure that Huawei has put on various companies in Italy, you can see that it is driving countries together and away from Beijing. So I think this is actually getting easier, and largely due to Chinese diplomacy.
Maybe still quite a lot of work to do, though, in places like Latin America and Africa and the Middle East, where China has certainly been making inroads over the last few years in terms of relationships and alliances.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And if you look at, the way in which many African states have become increasingly dependent, you're certainly seeing that sometimes called debt diplomacy. I'm not quite sure I'd call it that, because it is the nature of industrializing states that they do throw off a lot of cash, and China's doing what Japan did and Western Europe did and America did. So I'm not quite sure I put it down as debt diplomacy in such a crude sense. I'm not quite sure it's that strategic, but that level of dependence is something that is now a matter of concern. And you don't need to talk to many people in Nigeria or Kenya to hear stories, true or not, I don't know, but stories of Chinese investment projects that then result in mass remaining, large numbers of Chinese workers remaining, and rumors that they are released prisoners. Now, I don't know whether they are or not, but you hear a lot of these sort of rumors going around Africa, which suggests, at the very least, that the huge investment may be able to get you over the line with an elite that wants a share of the business, but is not driving popular support from the people.
I mean, you talked a bit about that wolf warrior diplomacy and some of the tensions over it. I mean, you personally have been sanctioned recently by China, and there is there is a sense in which the kind of the rhetoric, the actions on both sides are escalating. I mean, do you worry that it is escalating too fast to some extent and risks spinning out of control and creating, if not a real conflict, something much more serious than might necessarily have to be the case?
I mean, I haven't really been sanctioned. I've been put on a list of people who are supposedly sanctioned, but actually the Chinese state doesn't have the internal structures to sanction anybody because it's not geared up to do it. I mean, if I was sanctioned in the UK, my bank account would be closed within 24 hours. I can tell you because I've still got it open that I have a Chinese bank account that's still operating quite happily. Now, it's a crypto account, so it doesn't have any significant funds in it. But, you know, this is not a state that is structured to deal with a legal sanctioning system. So all they've done is they've said, you've sanctioned us, we're sanctioning you. Fine. Okay. I'm not, you know, I don't have any property in Macau. I'm not about to start, you know, holidaying in Shanghai, right? I mean, so it is of no relevance. What it's designed to do is it's designed to dissuade other people from speaking out who have you know, interests in China. And you know, but as I point out to people, we've all been sanctioned. It's just only some of us know about it. Michael Kovrig found out he was sanctioned when he wasn't allowed to leave China. You know, there's plenty of people who've been sanctioned by China and they only find out when the police turn up. I at least know in advance. Do you, Gordon? You know, would you go to Hong Kong today? Would you go to Beijing? I mean, stuff you've written. Yeah.
Well, it's certainly got tougher for journalists, I think. You
know, there's a couple of ABC journalists who have been held. There's a couple of you know, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig have been held. You know, I mean, there are a collection of people who are now being held by the Chinese state who didn't know they were sanctioned. I at least know I am. But look, your question about the different forms of escalation, I think the real area that concerns me, quite obviously, is the potential misunderstanding over something like the Paracel Islands in Taiwan, right? Because, I mean, one of the great advantages, of course, of the later Cold War period is we knew the capabilities of each other. We knew that if you do, you know, there was a relatively intricate two-step where we knew if you do this, then the Soviets will do that, then, you know, the West will do this, and so on. The problem we've got over Taiwan is nobody's quite sure. And the problem with uncertainty is it leads to mistakes, and it may lead to people feeling they have to react more because they've got to reassert a position. So what I'd like to see personally, because I think it is a peace-building move, is some clarity. You know, what is our defensive agreement with Taiwan? I mean, is it just weapons sales, or does it actually have territorial integrity? You know, what is our commitment to the Philippines? You know, again, is it just an allied state, or are we actually making sure these lines are clear? And if they are clear, what are we willing to do about them? Because, you know, the questions over red lines that we saw in the Obama administration, for example, they turned pink, right? Well, again, that leads to misunderstandings, and misunderstandings are dangerous. It is much better, you know, it's much better to know the other person's got a big dog and to stay away than to think it's a poodle and turn up and find out it's an Alsatian.
Speaking of poodles and Alsatians, I'll bring Nick in at this point and see if he has any questions for Tom. I wasn't suggesting you're either of those creatures, Nick, but and Suzanne as well. I wonder if you've got some questions, or if there are any we've got from the audience to bring in.
If I can kick off, I have been likened to a Rottweiler, actually, Gordon. I've kind of like
that's the one I was.
By me, I think.
A couple of questions, Tom, and one observation on Taiwan. Your comments really interesting because, of course, the hitherto, or up to now, the way people have kind of in the West, the US in particular, have approached Taiwan has been ambiguous because of the fear that if you spell out too clearly what the US commitment on Taiwan could be, that would be an own goal in terms of provoking the Chinese. That's just an observation. You might want to come back on it. But my two questions were, number one, you know, you said on the values point, it's not about values between the West and China. It's a small number of Communist Party dictators and everybody else. There's a feeling with some people that actually there's a choice between authoritarianism, which is nasty but works, and democracy, which is great but has led us, and obviously we're always going to choose that, probably everybody in this conversation would, but leads to division, people scrapping about identity politics, people refusing to accept election results and all that. And my fear is that the Chinese see that and say to their doubtless cowed people, look, do you want this rubbish, or do you want a nice stable authoritarian state where everybody does what they're told? So just a point there about, do you actually worry that the values choice is not as clear as I think you presented it earlier? Second point, completely different one, but there was a discussion of former intelligence chiefs earlier today about the Five Eyes, and there was a kind of debate, actually not much of a debate, about whether it's a good thing for the Five Eyes to be pulled into the policy space from being a purely intelligence sharing set of relationships. And I was interested, you referred to the Five Eyes a bit earlier, so I'd be really grateful for your views on what you think the Five Eyes could be in the Chinese context.
Sure. Well, I mean, let me touch on that values point and on the democracy point first of all. I think there is an illusion that you can have a stable authoritarian state. And the reality is actually it's very difficult, because the trick in any government is not the administration, it's the transfer of power. And every administration has to transfer power at some point because of a simple fact in humanity called death, that at some point the leader will die, right? I mean, maybe somebody's going to discover something soon. And of course, you know, the North Koreans have achieved the eternal rule of a now dead leader, which is quite remarkable. But the death of a leader is a transfer of power at some point. And how you achieve transitions of power is the challenge in all administrations. I mean, that's fundamentally it. And you can do it by effectively doing it infrequently but violently through a monarchy or through a dictatorship, or rather like a wobbly wheel on the front of a bicycle, frequently and gently, like in a democracy. Now, the Chinese had established a sort of a 10-year democracy, effectively, which was their way of having authoritarian transfers, if you like. And that allowed internal discussion and variability within a communist system. And here's where I'm slightly cautious about being too preachy about democracy in a Chinese context, because yeah, there are real challenges in governing a country the size of China and the internal unrest that is so evident even today in China. You know, there are protests, violent protests going on all the time in China, very often linked to pollution or local corruption or things like that. But they are happening the whole time. And what that allowed was a sort of an internal, I wouldn't say democracy, but certainly an internal passage of power within the communist elites. Now, Xi has ended that by ending term limits. And I think that is one of the most fundamental failures of his administration. I don't know why he did it. I don't know whether he thought it wasn't possible anymore to do peaceful transfers of power because he was too afraid that his money would be stolen off him, or his families or his elites would be, you know, his cabal would lose influence and be murdered. I don't know. Or whether he did it in a fit of hubris at an early stage in his, you know, in his tenure and now can't find a way out of it. Now, I mean, I can't answer the question. He's the president of China and I'm not. But you know, there'll be many people who have different views on it. But I think that is the challenge. The challenge is that actually, if you can't find a way to transfer power, actually you're just injecting instability. And the danger is that China has now injected much more instability into the regime and into the state than we recognize, and that actually it's much more chaotic and violent than is commonly acknowledged in places like the United Kingdom. It's chaotic because actually it is really hard to administer a country of 1.3 billion people. It's also really hard if you are so violent that nobody trusts you and they're all afraid of getting murdered. You know, I don't think, for example, that Wuhan's cover-up was particularly deliberate. But if you're afraid that you're going to end up down a salt mine if you give bad news, guess what? You won't give bad news until it's way too late and you can't hide it anymore. So it injects this level of instability much, much deeper into the system. And I think that's what we're seeing. So I don't want to overstate the democracy's point. But nor do I think that you can argue that authoritarianism, dictatorship, is a form of stability. It's not. It's not a form of stability any more than the Andreas Fault, the San Andreas Fault in California, is stable because it hasn't shaken today, right? I mean, you know, there will be another earthquake. We know that. On the question of Five Eyes, forgive me, Nick. I'm always struck by technical practitioners of an art who want to keep their art distinct. Soldiers want to do it with military alliances. Intelligence officers want to do it with intelligence alliances. You know, medical people want to do it with medical alliances and so on. I get that, and it's absolutely a respectable position for them to take. But the reality is all these decisions are political, because actually the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance is not an intelligence sharing agreement. There are plenty of those all over the world, all the time. You know, you do them temporarily with an organization you're working with in Afghanistan, or one you're working with in NATO or whatever. The difference about the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance is it's a bet on the future. It's a very, very different alliance. And the reason it's different is because we are culturally similar enough that we can bet that each other's grandchildren will probably keep the secrets that we shared with them today. That's why it works. So it's not an intelligence alliance in the normal sense where I'll show you mine if you'll show me yours. And by the way, there'll be tear lines and blackouts and you won't see everything and all bit, you know. The difference with the Five Eyes Alliance is it is fundamentally a political bet on 50 to 100 years into the future. So that's why it is different. Now, can it be expanded to Japan? That's hard. And I'm not going to tell you it's easy, because it's again, it's a bet on Japanese democracy for 100 years into the future. It's a bet on cultural alignments growing over the time and not splitting. Is it possible? I don't know, but I certainly think it's worth engaging with. And I don't think that you can look at these things as solely a practitioner's toolbox. They are political tools. They are a political statement. And in this, the Chinese, I'm afraid, are right. You know, the Five Eyes community is not a political alliance, and the New Zealand government have made various comments related to that have been overplayed by the Chinese, but, you know, to not make it into one. But it is fundamentally a statement of political alignment, the like of which is not possible in any other forum.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask, if I can, two questions for you. The first is, how are you thinking about what the government can do to boost innovation in the private sector to ensure that Western allies don't find themselves in similar situations like Huawei in the future? How do we ensure that Western private sector companies retain a development edge? And what is the government's role in supporting that innovation?
Right, so some of that is, I hope, going to be done through this National Security and Investment Bill that the UK is introducing and various other elements. But actually, quite a lot of it's done by simply saying, look, there are some practitioners we will not allow into this market, right? If you massively subsidize your goods so that you are undercutting producers, you are putting us at risk of finding ourselves with monopoly providers who we don't have any influence over. That's the Huawei problem. But there are many other examples in this. And so I think that the key government role is to make sure that the markets are real markets, that the suppliers are real suppliers and not front companies for, you know, state administrations, and that the debts that they're, you know, basing their investment growth off, whether those are debts to shareholders in terms of, you know, promises of future earnings, or whether they're debts to bondholders, as in quite literally debt, you know, these have got to be fair. Right? Because otherwise, all you're doing is you're allowing other people to undercut and influence your markets in ways that are not conducive to the public good. So I think that making sure that markets are fair is a fundamental aim, and that at least allows competitive growth in our own markets. The other thing, actually, that I think countries have got to do, and this is a wider alliance point, is that I think that, you know, we have given that's overstating it. We have not done enough common standard setting in recent years, and therefore we are creating divergent markets. Now, one reason we do that is because we like to encourage competition within different technologies, obviously, because it encourages you know, better products. But at some points, you do actually have to sit down and say, this is the standard, we're going to stick to it. Now, we've so far done it with 3, 4, and 5G. But actually now China is very much ahead on 6G. Now, if we allow those standards to be set by others, we will end up having to import the technology that they produce to a certain degree, right? And even if all we're doing is importing the code, or at least the code principles, we're importing values in exactly the same way as other countries imported our values when they started to use the common law of England and Wales. You know, just as we encoded our values into the Latin script of the legal texts, today values are encoded in the binary noughts and ones of digital processes. They literally encode concepts of privacy, of family, of security, of ownership as basic as any other form of constitution. And if you want proof of this, look at the different forms of AI that you get out of China and the United States. They are very, very different forms of AI. And that's not because the Chinese state has told one side to do one and the American government has told the other side to do one. No, it's because the programmers come from very different cultural places and have encoded their own cultures into the software.
Mm-hmm. And let me just defer quickly to Gordon or Nick if you have any final questions, and then I've got one final one before we go. No? Okay.
Good to you.
So final question. We've heard from a number of former international leaders today. We've talked very much, as Gordon mentioned, our focus has been on alliances over the last 2 days, and that will continue tomorrow. If you had one message that you knew would be received by the leaders of the Western allied countries on China, what is the one thing that you would like them to take to heart moving forward in understanding how to both compete with China, but also contain some of the more aggressive Chinese ambitions?
So I think the first thing to remember is don't be afraid. What Australia has demonstrated is that sanctions on a state in a globalized environment are merely sanctions on your own people. Effectively, what China has done is impose tariffs on its own citizens for the import of Australian goods. Fine, if they want to tax their own citizens, that's their problem, not mine. Australia has found quite successfully over the last year or two that their sanctioned goods have got plenty of other markets around the world, and it's not really an issue. Now, so the first one is don't be afraid. The second one is actually, this isn't the dragon that you think it is. China is going to be a very large economy for a very long time. It may even get beyond 13, 15, maybe even beyond 18% of the GDP of the world. But the democracies are in the high 70%. You know, we are so dominant in economic terms, and our markets are so important to Chinese goods that actually we haven't lost this battle, and there's no need to be defeatist about it. They don't run around like headless chickens, you know, saying that the sky is falling in. It's not. We're winning this, and we're winning it because free markets, democracy, human rights lead to long-term investment decisions, prosperity and happiness. We know that. I mean, you know, we've tried this experiment a few times in the last 2,000 years, and it always comes out that fairer run societies encourage longer-term investment, which encourage innovation and encourage technological advances. I mean, it's literally an experiment we've tried since the Greek states, right? I mean, you know, and it always plays out the same way. So we are going to win this. You know, there is absolutely no shadow of doubt in my mind that the free world is going to remain the dominant economic system and the dominant technological system in decades to come. Not in doubt. But it will only do so if we continue to believe it, we continue to work together, and we continue to, you know, stand up for the values that mean something to ourselves. If we get scared and decide that what we have to do is to make alliances and we have to, you know, back down and pretend that something isn't so, and, you know, effectively bend and fold in order to accommodate to a dictatorship, then we've lost, and it'll be our fault, not theirs.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an excellent note to end this conversation on. I can't thank you enough, Mr. Tugendhat, for joining us and sharing your perspective. I think it is refreshing in many ways and gives us a lot of things to think about as we think about the China threat moving forward. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to host you at the Cipher Brief.
Thank you very much. It's nice
Thanks.
to see you.
Thanks.
Gordon, thank you so much. A fantastic conversation. We really appreciate you bringing your excellent talent to bear with this interview. So thanks, Gordon.